Welcome to the Dynamist. I'm John Askonas, a senior fellow at the Foundation for American Innovation. For as long as humans have been innovating, there have been profound disagreements about technological progress and its implications. Every technological breakthrough, from the wheel to the printing press to artificial intelligence, has the potential to bring about enormous progress. But technology can also bring about transformational cultural change and even disaster. The way that society thinks about technological progress impacts the technologies it chooses to build. Should we be cautious about the adoption of powerful new tech? Or should we view growth itself as a positive good? These questions are as salient as ever today, with the emergent cultural and political debates around artificial intelligence and other technologies. A central figure in this debate is our guest today, Marc Andreessen. Marc really needs no introduction, but for the uninitiated, Marc is a renowned entrepreneur, investor, and software engineer. He co-authored Mosaic, the first widely used web browser, co-founded Netscape, and is one of the founding partners of the venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz. In October, Marc released the Techno-Optimist Manifesto, an essay which argues simply that technology and growth are good, unequivocally, and its opponents are bad. This view has become something of a creed for a knowing number of technologists and represents the belief in effective accelerationism, or EAC, as it's sometimes abbreviated online. Whether this belief wins or loses in the culture war over technological development will have a huge impact in the trajectory of AI in the coming years. And so understanding the values and ideas underpinning techno-optimism and effective accelerationism is vitally important. Marc, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Great, John. Great to be here.
No, really happy to have you. So I figure we can jump in. You've told us what you think, and I think there are a lot of interesting nooks and crannies in this essay to get into, and then later in the show we can address some of your critics. One of the most interesting things about the essay is actually your leading quote, which I don't think many people noticed. It's from Walker Percy. I'll read it. "You live in a deranged age, more deranged than usual, because despite great scientific and technological advances, man has not the faintest idea of who he is or what he is doing." But that quote is from Walker Percy's book, Lost in the Cosmos, which is one of my all-time favorite books. And it's from a section positing suicide, or specifically the contemplation of suicide as a cure for depression, saying to the reader, "Assume you are quite right about that, that the society is totally messed up. You are depressed because you have every reason to be depressed. No member of the other 2 million species which inhabit the earth and who are luckily exempt from depression would fail to be depressed if it lives the life that you lead." And then it says, you live in a deranged age. And in some ways, it's a cognate for that famous sort of Nietzsche quote about, the insanity, to be insane. And it's insane to be insane in insane times. It's a bad paraphrase of it. Why did you choose that quote? What does it have to do with the rest of the manifesto?
Yeah, so start with clearly he was the Rust Cohle of his time.
Absolutely. Time is a flat circle.
Evolution consciousness is a mistake. Evolution took us on a misguided path, which we should correct through suicide. So look, I like that quote. I won't endorse the rest of the worldview, but I like that quote, or that what he says in that quote for a number of reasons. I mean, one is I think he's stating a truth, at least in the section that I used. Which is, there has been over the last 500 years tremendous, scientific and technological advance. It's not clear to me that, we as a species have any better idea of who we are and what we're here for than we did before that, and, quite possibly less. And so I think there's a lot of truth to that. I also wanted to kind of signal right up front, kind of two things that I kind of get to later in the essay. One is I'm a techno-optimist, not a techno-utopian. And so I don't actually think the answers to the big questions about the meaning of life and the purpose of mankind and so forth are necessarily contained inside technology, or for that matter, inside capitalism. And I think that one of the ways that arguments around technology and capitalism tend to play out is that the critics of technology and capitalism sort of accuse it of not being able to provide full purpose, and then that sort of puts the defenders of technology and capitalism on their back foot, and they either have to, I think, over argue their position or they lose. And so I want to be clear, and I say this later in the manifesto. I'm not arguing that we bring all the answers. But look, at the same time, I do think there is kind of a smaller, maybe lowercase u utopian view, or kind of a smaller aspiration, which is like, look, scientific and technological progress like is itself good, and is itself meaningful, and is itself something that human beings should take, I think, great satisfaction, great pleasure, and should feel very good about doing. And let's just say, like, in the absence of the answers to the big questions, like if we can make material scientific and technological process, we can make a very large number of people much better off, in very, very tangible ways. And that seems to me to be a good in and of itself.
Yes, that's a great segue. So the next kind of epigraph is this quote, which I won't read in entirety, but it's kind of a 300,000 year perspective, saying that from 300,000 years up until 4,000 BC, you had kind of one technological epoch. But even from 4,000 BC to the Norman conquest or the Aztec Empire, you had technologies that would have been familiar to a person born in Sumer in 4,000 BC, and then we had this sort of massive explosion. I was really struck in one of your critics, which we'll read later, that when casting about for the unalloyed technological goods that they could kind of give a half measure of praise to, they came up with, I can take an Uber home if the subway's closed, and I can get books delivered to my house. How much of this problem, how much of the question of this essay has to do with historical perspective?
Yeah, look, I mean, this is something that I would describe sort of a lot of the sort of mainstream critics of technology and capitalism just kind of stumble over right out of the gate, which is basically they lack a historical perspective, and the historical perspective in my mind, and I think in the history is quite clear and not even really argued with. I mean, even Marcs would not argue, I think, with what I'm about to say, which is, once upon a time we all lived in mud huts. We all scratched out a living as subsistence farmers. The famous line, Hobbes, life was nasty, brutish, and short. Nature is red in tooth and claw. Like, that was all true. And so we prehistorical man, basically cowered by the campfire, a lot of the time, hoping, to not die. And so, things were very bad. And then kind of what happens is whatever, level of technological and material civilization we inherit, I think there's just a natural human inclination to kind of take it for granted and just kind of assume that like everything that happened before now is our birthright. And then everything that we could possibly do going forward, kind of either pales in comparison or is probably bad. But I think that historical perspective is very important, because the fact is, we did figure out a formula to be able to lift billions of people out of abject poverty. We did figure out a formula that led to creating the quite at least relatively wealthy material civilization that we have today. We did figure out a formula to fundamentally resolve many of the issues that mankind dealt with for thousands of years around just massive early childhood mortality. We today live in a world where we have just like tremendous resources at our fingertips that the King Louis XIV would have just absolutely marveled at. And so, we do have this magical formula, and just because we like to get cynical and pessimistic and like to pretend that we just inherited it or that we deserve it or that it would have happened, without, a spirit of adventure or a spirit of capitalism, people breaking the rules, the perceived rules around technology and capitalism that we would have had all that. And I don't think we would have. And I think we should recognize that was a real tangible thing that people fought very hard to achieve. And that we continue to be in a position to follow that path.
Yeah. So in the open, you open with the lies that you believe are kind of in the groundwater today, so to speak. Quote, "We are being lied to. We are told that technology takes our jobs, reduces our wages, increases inequality, threatens our health, ruins the environment, degrades our society, corrupts our children, impairs our humanity, threatens our future, and is ever on the verge of ruining everything." And later on, you refer to these as updated forms of the myth of Prometheus, and updated forms of Frankenstein, Oppenheimer, the Terminator. So as you well know, in most traditional societies, certainly in those that are with the beginning of philosophy and a practice of reflection, there has been this caution about technologies that we can't control, or technologies that amplify innate human flaws. So we think of the hubris of Icarus flying too close to the sun, and yet there at least have also been epochs where this was glorified. You say, quote, "For hundreds of years we properly glorified this until recently." So what changed? Is this horror, or is this recoiling from this, our potential, our birthright, is something that's just been growing through history, or was there a period of exception?
Yeah, so I'll start by conceding a couple of things right up front, right? One is that, look, many technologies are double-edged swords, right? And I think the reason why the myth of Prometheus is so deeply encoded in our culture, kind of in our belief system, the technology is potentially, disastrous, potentially, ruinously disastrous, is encoded in that myth, which is, right, like fire was this massive gift to humanity, right, in the form of heat and light and warmth and cooking food, safety in the night, defense, and then it was also a weapon. And of course, fire is a weapon today, right? Like you drop a bomb on somebody, like you've harnessed fire, and people are being killed around the world today with fire. So and fire doesn't discriminate by morality or ethics. It kills it kills whoever it gets subjected to it. So look, like that's real, right? A big thing that happened obviously in the 20th century was the rise of heavily mechanized warfare and sort of this industrial scale slaughter, and again that was real, like that that happened, and continues to be a big danger. And so technologies are double-edged swords. Another thing I'll just say right up front, and I didn't focus on this as much in the essay, but I think it's important, which is I think there's actually kind of a three-way argument. So technology good in certain respects, technology bad in certain respects, and then there's like a third point that has to do with the debate around this, which is technology does tend to reorder social relations and does tend to reorder, therefore, power in society. And this is, here I draw on a guy named Elton Morrison who wrote about this in the mid 20th century, which maybe we could talk about. But I always kind of interpret technology debates kind of through the lens of kind of whose ox is being gored from a power status standpoint. And I think a lot of the debates revolve around that. So anyway, so having kind of put a pin in those two things, I will say, look, the incredibly striking thing is that you don't have to go back that far in history to read basically, many both popular and expert accounts and stories about and philosophies about and manifestos about technology that are the polar opposite of what we get today. And I would say in particular, my kind of, I think kind of the most interesting period in history was what was now referred to as the Second Industrial Revolution, which was sort of roughly between 1880 and World War II. And which is when much of what we consider to be our modern, industrial technological civilization was born and created. The creation and deployment of everything from electric power to automobiles, radio, television, railroads, highways, cars, logistics, by the way, also modern weapons, kind of all came, from that period. And throughout that period, like you basically, and they debated many things, but you kind of read any account of technology or progress in that period, and they're glorying in technological sophistication. So it wasn't that long ago that the narrative was precisely the opposite. You could argue two things. You could argue they were being utopian and ultimately silly, and then we learned harsh lessons, and now we should be appropriately techno-pessimists, right? And some people reacted to for sure to World War I, World War II in particular, by reaching that conclusion. Look, others, I would include myself in this, kind of view that basically what happened was the sort of increasing role of technology in our society was sort of hijacked, by ideologues who have an interest in proselytizing a kind of very different kind of philosophy for life and for society, ultimately derived from communism, and basically those ideological actors basically hijacked technology to use for their broader social agenda, and they've basically been doing that since the 1960s, and that in particular is what I object to.
Yeah, that's we'll get to the enemies in a little bit. So you have one line here, a little further down in the section, which I think presses this point that you're just making home a little bit. We believe the techno-capital machine is not anti-human. In fact, it may be the most pro-human thing there is. It serves us. The techno-capital machine works for us. All the machines work for us. Now, the even that phrase, the techno-capital machine, is sort of is Nick Landian, accelerationist. Thing, for Nick Land, the techno-capital machine is anti-human, and that's a good thing. You obviously disagree with that. So I guess the point I'd make is that to the extent that there's this large technological system driven by the engine of capitalism, to what extent are we actually, quote, kind of in control of it?
Yeah. So, and look, this is a very big, debate, and this is, I think we'll talk about this, maybe later, but there's a whole kind of, especially kind of, there's a left-wing critique around this, and probably also right-wing critique. But like, look, I think there's this tendency, and I don't like Nick Landis like has 200 IQ points in me, so I don't want to kind of try to represent him. Although I will say I think he's changed his views a lot over the years.
He certainly has, yeah.
As well, at least in my understanding. And so, I mean, look, we do, there is a critique of this, which is, these sort of impersonal forces kind of take on a mind of their own, right? And this sort of idea, and this Landian idea that sort of capitalism is a form of artificial intelligence. Actually companies are a form of artificial intelligence. 60 years ago, they had this concept early on with computers called cybernetics, where they actually thought much more deeply about kind of the intersection of people and machines than I think even we do today. And so you kind of refer to like a corporation as a cybernetic organism, which is like a form of artificial intelligence. And so, I mean, look, I do think there's some substance to that. But I mean, look, this machine like exists for a reason, right? And it exists for, and we built it for a reason. And I'm sure you and your audience are well familiar with the reasons, but they are very fundamental and very important. Which is capitalism. Market-based economies are a superior way to increase standard of living. Over long sweeps of time for very large numbers of people. That is a machine that we booted up at one point, and we are very, very happy that we did. And its primary function, like, it's not perfect. Like, I'm not a utopian on these things, but like its primary function is to increase the welfare and health of the human species. And then same thing with technology. I mean, what is technology at its core, right? Technology is new ideas, new thinking, new ways of doing things. Again, we decided as a civilization, at some point, probably starting with the Greeks and then, kind of progressing over time, we decided that we were actually not going to, kind of live in a world and in a mind space where we were going to be, exclusively focused on the past and kind of, and live in fear. We decided we were going to take control of nature. We decided we were going to create new ideas. We decided that when we were confronted with problems, we would invent our way out of them. And so I think both parts of that are just like overwhelmingly clearly pro-human. And again, I think the results are in. We're sitting here after maybe call it 300 years of industrial civilization, 500 years of sort of modern whatever Western civilization, and we far more people with far higher standard of living, with in a far safer world, far less random death. Far more human flourishing than ever in history. And so, like, I think the criticisms are interesting, but I think overwhelmingly the argument has to be that this is a machine that's working on our behalf.
Well, I suppose the question is as this accelerates, if it accelerates, and we can get to the alternative of degrowth, because I mean, I think one of the things that's implicit in your essays that human civilization is sort of like a shark. Like it can't just like take a break for a minute. Like when it stops swimming, really it dies. Bad things happen. We'll talk about that. But to push back a little bit on this, one wonders to the extent that capitalism or corporations are artificial intelligences, and I think there's a lot of merit to this claim on a kind of cybernetic basis. One wonders whether they don't have a little bit of kind of an alignment problem, because it isn't as if capitalism as a structure has like the common wheel of the human species as its object, right? It has growth, expansion, profit as its object, and you hope, and in many cases there is an alignment between those things and the common wheel of humanity, and that's where you get growth, expansion, cheap clothes, cheap energy, cheap food, great things. But then you also have shortcuts, right? You also have maybe not the paperclip problem, but like one thinks of super stimuli. Like if I can provide our friend Antonio Garcia Martinez has said that maybe AI porn is the great filter. There are all kinds of ways as we reach this point of having so much technological power where you could imagine at least sort of short-circuiting actual human flourishing with cheap substitutes that are market efficient. So how do we avoid that outcome?
Yeah, so let's see. What's the best way to come at this? So to start with, I think if I'm correct, I think if I did my editing properly, I don't think I actually used the word capitalism in the manifesto. I very deliberately used the term markets.
Techno-capital machine is probably the closest you got to it.
Techno-capital machine is the closest, but I specifically when I talk about economics, I talk about markets, not capitalism. And I look, like I would argue that they are synonyms, and so maybe that's a distinction without a difference. But I wanted to make kind of a point by doing that, which is, capitalism is this kind of term that ends up loaded kind of with this idea. And by the way, there's, there's some merit to that, this idea of like that, capital is this kind of impersonal force. The sort of main way though to look at capitalism is a process of free markets, right? And meaning it's a bottoms up process, not a top down process. And it's a bottoms-up process that has to do with individuals, individual humans, in individually and then over time in groups in the form of companies, making microeconomic decisions, on their own behalf in terms of what they buy and sell, and then that, of course, aggregating up into the much larger emergent system, that we ultimately refer to as capitalism. And of course, capital plays a sort of catalytic role in causing that to happen. But fundamentally, that from a behavioral standpoint, what's happening is individual people, you and I every day, making micro decisions with our dollars about what we're going to do to get dollars and what we're going to do to what we're going to get in return for spending them. And so like that when I talk about capitalism, like that's very much what I mean. And then, by the way, I should also say, and I maybe alluded to this in the manifesto, but it's maybe a somewhat different topic, which is, look, markets can and do go bad. Obviously the left is sort of consumed with ideas on how they go bad in terms of externalities, and I think sometimes that's overblown, but sometimes there are points to that. But I think the right actually has a pretty good critique on how markets go bad, and which I actually think is a bigger problem in our modern society, which is markets go bad basically when they become captured, and specifically when they become captured by either monopolies or cartels on the one hand, or government, basically regulatory capture on the other hand. And in fact, when you get into the microeconomics of industries, which we do a lot as venture capitalists, what you find is that monopolies and cartels in the private sector generally correspond to regulatory capture in government. You rarely get a stable monopoly cartel situation if the government ultimately is not defending it. And we could talk about many examples of that, by the way, including higher education. Right?
Absolutely.
And so, like, yes, if by markets you mean, basically a landscape of monopolies and cartels intertwined with the government that basically can arbitrarily brutalize people, like, I'm not in favor of that. If by markets you mean the Hayekian view of, millions and then billions of people making micro decisions, exploiting all aspects of local knowledge, and then ultimately, being able to have a thriving, market-based economy with, millions of products with supply and demand recalibrated in real time based on price signals, like that, 100%, absolutely. Like, to me, like, that's clearly and obviously the formula. And then, to the extent that markets have flaws, if those flaws are tied to the perversion of that idea of bottoms-up free markets for whatever reason, then at that point you want to figure out how to go in and fix that. You actually want, like, the solution to most criticisms people have of markets is actually solved by actually making the markets work better, not by overriding them. And that is something I believe very strongly.
Yes, absolutely. So one last question, kind of on this section. There's some people who are with, in fact, many people, many otherwise pro-tech, pro-acceleration folks who agree with you kind of up to this point in human history, but say AI is different. So, for instance, there's an interview with Flo Crivello, founder of AI platform Lindy, a thinker in the AI space. He had this to say, quote, "I'm a libertarian. I used to work at Uber where I saw regulatory capture and I saw cartels. I totally understand how folks like Marc Andreessen built such a deep and justified hatred and reaction for this nonsense that the pattern recognition immediately triggers when they see what's happening with AI. It's chill. I totally get it. But this time is really different. There's something really special that's happening, not just in the markets, not just in the economy, not just in the country, in the universe. There's a new form of life that is being birthed." So to those who would say that, all well and good, Techno-Optimist Manifesto, but not for AI, what's your response to that question?
Yeah, look, start saying Flo's a really bright guy, so people should definitely read, whatever he writes or says. But like, look, they're right in there is sort of the category error that I think, unfortunately, kind of people fall for, and it's kind of this. By the way, it also is a recurring pattern in the history of technology, which is this idea that it's a new form of life. And of course, the answer to that is no, it's not. Right? Like, no, it's not a new form of life at all. Right? Like that, it's a fundamental category error. Like it is powerful and important, but it's an application of mathematics. And it quite literally is an application of linear algebra. But by the way, we do live in this interesting moment where linear algebra is actually under attack. Yes. Algebra is actually under attack on two fronts at the same time. Basically the woke warriors don't want to teach it in schools anymore because there might be differentials in outcome in grades, and then sort of the elites don't want to use it to build AI because it might run out of control and ruin everything. So, and this is kind of my point in my manifesto. Like we've wedged ourselves somehow into a mentality that basically, like, essentially solves ultimately down to the idea that algebra is bad. And like, look, like, I don't buy it. Right? It's math. It's very sophisticated math. It's wonderful math. It's going to do many amazing things. It's math. This is not life. these things are not self-aware. There is no grand inevitability to them, taking over anything. I mean, just here's a very basic aspect of the category error, which is, life, with every aspect of life, that exists, actual life is the product of 4 billion years of evolution, right? And so has been, programmed for a mode of survival, right? And, sort of the battle to the death of, natural selection, the entire organism of life is wired for that. And all the things associated with that. Like, this is not that at all. Like, that's not how these systems are designed, not even for a minute. And so to me, it's this sort of, I'm sure, the term anthropomorphizing, right? There's just this, there's this recurring, here I will draw on history, there's this recurring pattern of, oh my God, it's a machine, it does something, people in the past did those things, oh my God, it's going to replace people. Is this, recurring phenomenon, that kind of goes way back in kind of both our dreams and nightmares. And I just think it's it's just a flat out category error. Like, it's just not how that stuff works.
Yeah, absolutely. So now that folks have a sense of what you argue in the essay, and I recommend everyone listening at home to read the manifesto. Actually, I guess that's an interesting question, Marc. What you dubbed this a manifesto. You've written other things that are not manifestos before, some interesting essays, and your previous essay, "It's Time to Build," didn't spark nearly the kind of caterwauling and wailing as this one did. What made you want to write a manifesto, and a really manifesto-y manifesto at that?
Yeah, so, quite honestly, like the last, 10 years, and in retrospect, the last 30 years, I found to be relatively bewildering in a lot of ways. One of the ways to look at the manifesto is that it's actually Clinton Gore liberalism circa 1995. Basically pulled out of my memory and put down on the page. Look, like many, I mentioned that, like, many of the ideas in the manifesto are straight out of the sort of second industrial revolution era, or the people of that era would have. Look, I think people generally, whether a lot of people in whether it's 1890 or 1920 would have just read it and said, oh yeah, basically, of course. Frankly, a lot of people in the 1990s would have read it and said, oh, kind of obviously this is the case, of course. Like basically in the 1990s, we thought we had a grand bargain, essentially, and it was basically Clinton Gore liberalism, and sort of centrist Democrats, and I was part of it. Like I knew Clinton and Gore, and I was a supporter of them, and I supported Clinton in 96 and Gore in 2000, and we at the time it seemed like we kind of had everything figured out, and sort of the formula of that time that we all thought we had figured out was, kind of, we get to be technologists, we get to build these new things, we get to be capitalists, right? We get to build companies, and then and those are good. Like both parts of that are actually a good activity, and the internet actually is like a good thing, and the computer is a good thing, and algebra is good. And then basically, if those things work, then you make money, and then what you do with the money is philanthropy, right? And then you sort of feed the money back into society, and there are these sort of obvious ways to apply money in philanthropy, and then that's how you basically, close the cycle, and then ultimately help people, and ideally help people with their quality of life, but maybe also help with education and with other things that help more people participate in this process. And so, this is just like a normie, this is like just like received, mother's milk wisdom, kind of thing, and then. Basically the last, 15 years, and especially the last 10 years, like this, from my perspective, this level of sort of radicalized rage, and a lot of people have experienced this in different areas of their life, either as participants in it or recipients of it. But, the way that I've experienced it is this level of just sort of radicalized rage that's sort of fundamentally anti-capitalist and, ultimately fundamentally communist, and then fundamentally anti-technological and Luddite. This sort of, what you might call sort of a left-wing reactionary scream, that kind of hit, and I think really put the whammy on the press, and really put the whammy on academia, and on a lot of cultural commentators. I met one of my heroes yesterday. I won't name his name, but he's one of the top science fiction writers of the era, and like he just like hates me, like just like visceral disdain.
He's a science fiction writer.
Yeah, science fiction writer. He's like an actual legend. I don't want to name him, but he's like a legendary science fiction writer. He's like his stuff. You've heard of him. He's like he's like very successful movies based on his work. He's very highly respected, and like he just absolutely dripping with contempt for capitalism and for technology, and just like could not be more like dismissive and acidic and sour about the whole thing. And so it's just like, yeah, it's just, and this is sort of my reaction is like, aren't you a science fiction writer? Like really, this is it? Like after everything we've done as a civilization to get to the point where we have everything that we have and all the potential that we have, and like basically anything new is just terrible and evil, and the people who do it are terrible and evil. Like, I just think there's a level of derangement. Going back to the Walker Percy quote, like we live in a deranged age, and people have basically just gotten like, I call it a demoralization campaign. Like there's a whammy that's been put on people, and it's I think and look, like I said, I'm not a utopian, and I think there are critiques that are worth discussing. But by and large, I think the picture is clear, and this idea that this is all terrible and awful, I think is just, I mean, it's both destructive, and then also in the end, it's also silly. And so it was in my discussions with Silicon Valley founders, when they find themselves wondering if what they're doing is like morally good, I think somebody has to actually like step up and say that it is.
So was that your primary audience in mind? The founders you work with who are sort of the subject of this demoralization campaign?
Yeah, well, so that's ultimately, I mean, for everything I do, that's my day job, right? And so, that's kind of my that's my identity, as the kids say, right? And so,
you identify as a techno-optimist.
my identity is as a techno-optimist. So, Scott Adams says, I am an individual. Fully committed to my faith. So I am so I'm always kind of thinking about, of course, like everybody does, the next me. I'm thinking about the next 22-year-old who's kind of trying to figure things out. The 22-year-olds like we deal with, they've got the instincts, like they know, like, deep in their gut, they have all this figured out. They've already figured this out. They know, they just, they're 22. They probably have not read, they probably haven't read everything. They probably haven't like, thought about how to articulate it. And so, if I can do that, I think that's helpful to them. But then look also more broadly, right? Is obviously right. A very large number of people now are asking these questions and wondering. And of course, sort of the pessimists have very loud megaphones. I mean, the pessimists get paid, a fair amount of money to have, kind of very big megaphones, and to kind of proselytize this, what I think is a very kind of acidic and destructive view. And so, I definitely this has a broader audience in mind also.
So speaking of deranged pessimists, do you mind if we talk about some of your critics?
Sure.
So have you read any of the kind of criticisms of the mainstream media?
So I will confess. So I have not, for the most part, I don't think I have read the left-wing critiques. And to be quite honest, and one is just super unpleasant, but also, I've read a lot of. I mean, I've lived in a world of left-wing critique now for at least for the last 15 years, if not my whole life. And so I find they tend to kind of get, the arguments are straightforward and ultimately repetitive, and I think incorrect. And so I haven't spent as much time on those. Personally, I find the right-wing critiques more interesting, sort of more original and ultimately more challenging. But I'm happy to dig into whatever you think.
All right. So one of the interesting things is that I think 3 or 4 I'm gonna go over, all but one are in technology magazines. Like I remember growing up, technology magazines like Wired, Gizmodo, TechCrunch were pro-technology almost to a fault, right? You'd have like the latest like crappy Palm Pilot, and it would be sort of singing its praises as we've reinvented computing or whatever. Why is it that technology journalism has like turned on technology?
Yeah, look, it's the same thing that sort of happened to every other sort of mainstream institution in the last 20 years or 50 years or whatever. They got captured, and it's just like, even without drawing a value judgment on it, it's just very easy to see how different they are. I mean, you mentioned Wired. If you pull an issue of Wired from 1998 or from for that matter 2008, you compare it to today, like they're completely different. And people, you've written at length about all the changes in the media landscape, but basically they've all been captured. I think you alluded to TechCrunch. I think a great example of this is the original founder and original voice of TechCrunch, Michael Arrington. He recommended the Manifesto on his Twitter account and said how great he thought it was. His successors six generations removed, who run the sort of whatever TechCrunch is today, of course they're full on they're full on in the acid bath, kind of with the rest of the media, and so that they've changed radically, and so and this is sort of part of the challenge today is like it's and people lament this from different directions, but it's very hard to find a quote unquote mainstream anything at this point, right? And so they 90% of them have planted themselves on one side, and then 10% have planted themselves quite firmly on the other side.
So speaking of TechCrunch, their critical article of you, which somehow had three, it was like a short, it wasn't that long, maybe a couple thousand words, had three authors on the byline. So really, bringing their full intellectual firepower. And it was entitled, "When was the last time Marc Andreessen talked to a poor person?" So we can leave with that, Marc. When's the last time you talked to a poor person about their problems?
So look, I don't want to get, I'm not, I don't want to like necessarily get too personal on this stuff, but look, I just say, I grew up in the rural Midwest in the 1970s and 80s. I had relatives who still didn't have indoor plumbing. Right. I used outhouses in Iowa winters with 30 below. I've seen and lived kind of the full spectrum. And so, and again, this goes kind of straight to the point of the manifesto and straight to the point of, the generalized left-wing critique of capitalism, which is, the critique is, the sort of constant, kind of left-wing attack on capitalism is, oh, this is somehow, to the glorification of the rich and to the detriment of the poor. And it's sort of this Marxist, us versus them, zero sum, kind of thing. And of course, right, as we now know, right, the opposite is true. Capitalism, market-based economies are the engine that lift people out of poverty by the billions. And the more markets, the better functioning markets you have, and the more choice people have to participate in them, and the more they get the sort of boot of centralized control lifted off their throats, the faster their economies grow and the faster their standards of living rise. Right. And so I just think on that one, it's the results are already in. You can cling to Marxism and Marxism derived ideas in 2023 if you want to, but I don't find that it goes anywhere.
It's also strange because one has to ask the question of the journalists: when's the last time you talked to a poor person who wasn't a journalist? Poor people aren't anti-technology. Whenever I talk to somebody who's in a lower socioeconomic class, they have their issues, and they'll talk about the economy, they'll talk about inequality, they'll talk about all these other things. But I've never heard anyone be like, and you know what really is making my life worse? New technology.
Yes.
Yeah.
I hate my iPhone. I blame it for everything. So
that's right.
Yeah. Well, so you see this in the numbers, right? You see this in numbers, right? Which is obviously if you poll the quote unquote elites, right? So if you poll and you can define those different ways, but you could certainly poll the people who are in a position, for example, of narrative power, like journalists, cultural power. You could also define it by people who live in a certain set of cities. You could also define it as people who have certain kinds of high-end education, which I believe that all three of those journalists have very blue chip education. I went to a state school. But I'm pretty sure they, if I recall correctly, they went to very fancy schools. And so if you poll obviously the elites are just furious. And this goes back to the Morrison thing, which maybe we could talk about, which is the role that technology plays in informing the elites. But for sure there's elite hatred. Look, if you do broad-based surveys, and Gallup does this, Edelman does this, other people do this. If you do broad-based surveys of the American population, technology polls really high. And technology companies poll in the 70s, right, which is super high. Journalism polls at 15, and big tech polls at 70. And so, normal people, going about their lives, this is not the thing that they're worried about. And generally they view technology as something that's, important and powerful and liberatory and, exciting for them. By the way, on the AI topic, look, this is super relevant point today because, of course, one of the economic critiques of AI, or one of the left-wing critiques is, this is going to lead to greater centralization of wealth and power. One of the sort of amazing things about AI, which was also true of smartphones, also true of the internet, also true of personal computers, but one of the really amazing things is that AI actually is consumer first. So the best AI in the world is the one that you use when you just go on ChatGPT as just a normal person. That's the best today. And the best image generation and video generation today is you go on Midjourney or DALL-E, right? Just like a normal person. You go to Microsoft GPT, Microsoft Bing, you go to Google Bard. These are the best, and there's others. I mean, there's others obviously, derived from Llama and so forth, that you can also go to. But the best AIs are fully public. They're available for everybody to use today. Many of them are actually available for use for free. If they cost money, they cost $20 a month. There's no better AI, right? I can't spend $1 million and get a better AI than ChatGPT 4. right? Like it doesn't exist. In the same way, I can't spend $1 million and get a better iPhone. Like it literally doesn't exist. And so there is this amazing thing that I talk about in the essay, which is our techno-capitalist, capital civilization, like however it's evolved over the years. Like what's happening right now is the best technology is actually hitting individuals first and at extremely high scale, right? Hundreds of millions of people are already using these AI systems in their daily lives. And so it just seems very clear to me, like on the facts, that this technology is sort of inherently democratizing. It's inherently liberatory, and to the extent that you are genuinely interested in the kind of in the less well off, like these technologies being available on a basically equal footing to everybody in society out of the gate is, of course, one of the most equalizing things you can possibly imagine.
Yeah, I think this is a really underrated point, Marc. I mean, for most of human history, the story was of luxuries which were expensive and hugely labor intensive. And then as we get new technologies, the cost of those luxuries would sort of go down. But there would also be the new luxuries that the wealthiest in society could attain. And this might be the first era in human history where, for some things at least, this hasn't really been the case. Like the Sultan of Brunei probably has an iPhone, and the same kind of iPhone that you or I might have. I remember kind of about 10 years ago, there was a company that came out wanting to make sort of luxury cell phones with 24 karat 24 karat cases and leather and mahogany, and they flopped because it wasn't a better phone than the iPhone was. And this is an extraordinary achievement in human history, and an extraordinary equalizing achievement.
Yeah, this is one of the things, the thing that economists say about this is they say that the Queen of England always had silk stockings.
Yep.
Right, like the Queen of England always had the best of the best. It's sort of mass markets and the sort of mass diffusion technology that basically has brought all of those physical luxury goods, and many of the experiential luxury goods to put them in everybody's hands. There's this sort of kind of interesting question you could always kind of ask, which is like, okay, would Queen Victoria or Louis XIV, like given the chance to like change lives with a sort of a modern, kind of member of the middle class, the American middle class, like, on the one hand, you're like, well, of course he wouldn't, because, there'd be this massive loss in status and power and so forth. But on the other hand, like, antibiotics and, 100-inch television screens, and, modern cars, he would have just been like absolutely stunned and flabbergasted. I think would have been quite tempted to change places. This also, of course, immediately kind of brings up the sort of thing on status orientation, right? Because of course the critique of everything you and I just said is like, yeah, but that doesn't account for changes in status, and people aren't just sensitive to their absolute standard of living; they're also very sensitive to their relative status. And I think that that's true, and I think that that's important. Ultimately, by the way, I think that's also the source of a lot of the kind of, as I said, kind of acidic kind of rage that we feel today. And you could say journalists is an example of this, and many of your professor colleagues is especially people who have been used to being in a position of high cultural and societal power, have been in a gatekeeper role, an ability to especially the ones who have been in a position to be able to determine what people think. Obviously, those people are just like completely enraged by what they view as the corrosive effect of the democratization of access to information and technology. I mean, they're just
think of the misinformation, Marc. The misinformation and my favorite category, malinformation. You know what malinformation is? Malinformation is information that is true, but is like politically inconvenient at a given time. So I'll tell you something that's true, but makes you think things that are politically inconvenient. That's called malinformation. Yeah,
out of yes, facts out of the facts.
It used to call it inconvenient truths, but that was an aeon ago. Yeah, I think your manifesto would have hit different if you just called it the Clinton Gore 1995 manifesto. It would have had a whole other set of critics. So on the TechCrunch, there's one interesting line that stood out to me in this TechCrunch piece. It's a quote. It's both this and the Gizmodo piece, which isn't worth reading. Went after you for being a libertarian, apparently. So, quote, the libertarian-esque world where technology solves all of our problems, poverty and climate change are eradicated, and an honest meritocracy reigns supreme. So that's what they accuse you of desiring, which I think is true. Though Andreessen may call us, quote, communists and Luddites for saying so, his dreams are unrealistic and founded upon a flawed premise that technology exclusively makes the world better. Now, here's what struck me about this, of course, is that this is exactly what communists used to believe. Like the Communist Manifesto is one of the earliest, like, true techno-optimist manifestos, right?
Can you describe that? Actually, people don't know that.
Can you
describe that?
The whole point of the Communist Manifesto is that capitalism has brought about this revolution in social relations and economic productive relations that finally results in actually building efficiencies. So many efficiencies that all of the material goods that people need can be produced. The only thing that's stopping everyone from living a life of kind of a 4-hour work week, where you famously, you would spend an hour at the factory in the morning and then go fishing in the afternoon and write poetry by fire at night. The only thing that's stopping that is the greed of capitalists. But all you have to do, once you have this technological infrastructure, all you have to do is have a class revolution, overthrow the greedy capitalists, and have a dictatorship of the proletariat, and you're set. But the whole thing is entirely premised on technological growth. And in fact, there's this split in the late 19th century, early 20th century between within the kind of broader revolutionary left movement over this question, because the really hardcore Marxists say an industrial proletariat is a precondition of a successful revolution, contra some of the anarchists who think you can have a kind of agrarian revolution. Now, ironically, the way that's happened is that it turns out that capitalism is an important stage from feudalism to capital, or communism is an important stage from feudalism to capitalism. That's how it's worked out in China and Russia and a lot of other places. But anyways, this idea that, like, who's really the idea that a technology solving our problems of poverty and climate change and an honest meritocracy is like opposed to communism is just hilarious. So what happened on the left?
Yeah. So look, part is like, look, as you said, that this was a doctrinal dispute, right? 100 years ago, right? So, and I just expand on this for a moment, because I think this is very important to how this thought process has arrived. Like, this was a critique. Western communists actually critiqued Lenin, right, at the time of the Russian Revolution.
Yes.
On this basis, right? And basically the accusation that a lot of Western communists made towards Lenin when he took over Russia was basically that he was trying to, what the kids would say, speed run communism in a flawed way. So he was trying to take, Russia at the time was still an agrarian peasant feudalist society. It was not an industrialized power at that. It was not an industrialized society at that time, and he basically tried to speed run them from agrarianism through to communism without going through the intermediate stage of industrial capitalism. I read just when I was trying to figure this out years ago. I read this book. I was like, I got to learn more about all this Marxism stuff. So I read this book. There's this guy, I think his name is George Cohen, something Cohen. He was a lifetime communist professor at Oxford, as they are. And he wrote this book in the 70s on Marx's theory of history. And, he kind of goes through the whole thing. And then he added for the later paperback, he added an appendix in the late 90s. And it basically was, how do we explain, the USSR collapsing? And his analysis was, it was this analysis. He said, it's because Lenin basically skipped that intermediate stage of industrial capitalism. And he said, therefore, he said, the collapse of the USSR proves that Marx was right all along.
Can't argue with that, Marc.
Exactly. Yeah. And in fact, I'm sure but like the history of Russia then is right. Lenin takes control of an agrarian society. He immediately drives it into mass famine. Millions of people die like right out of the gate. This is way before Stalin. And then he actually backpedals, right? He implements the so-called new economic program, and he actually invites in the capitalists, including many of them American, who basically create what then passed for, sort of industrial, the industrial system of Russia. And then of course, in World War II, we then gave them we basically airdropped in every possible piece of technology we knew how to make as part of the war effort. We let in, what was it, in the 1940s, in the early 40s, we were so aggressive. The FDR administration was so aggressively trying to, for whatever set of reasons, advance the Soviets technologically at that time, that we actually let KGB officers take film camera crews around the most modern American factories and literally take films of everything, so that they could go back to Russia and they could build factories themselves. By the way, in the cases where we didn't just simply build the factories for them. And so anyway, yes, exactly. Like, the sort of true on communists know the importance of, the whole point of communism was material progress. The whole point, kind of that was to sort of harness, industrialization to that end. I mean, look, what happened, I think what happened, I mean, my interpretation is what happened is like that it didn't work. It didn't work out. The USSR and every other communist society in the 20th century was a disaster on every front, from, standard of living to human rights to, to the environment, by the way. They're ruinously destructive to the environment, far worse than capitalist societies. And it didn't work. And then, by the 1950s, 1960s, the emotion, the sort of resentment of communism, continued, but the arguments just, basically didn't work anymore. I mean, people weren't buying it after the Stalin and then Khrushchev eras, and so then it rotated into whatever it is, that we have today. And so basically, and this is sort of the thing, is they're kind of running, the sort of left-wing critics on this stuff, they're kind of running on they're running on fumes, in the sense of they're running on old ideas that they have sort of mutated over time. But to your point, they've mutated them in a direction where even the creators of those ideas would think that they're fundamentally not being serious.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, one suspects, reading your critics, that most of them anyways, that they simply actually just don't know anything. Like, they actually haven't read anything. I mean, I was in a bookstore with a left-wing friend of mine over the summer, and he found a copy of Das Kapital, and he was saying, like, "Oh, you should read this. You might find it interesting." And my eyes perked up, and it's like, "Oh, I'd love to talk about Das Kapital. Like, what do you think of chapter 15?" And he sort of was flummoxed, and I realized that he'd never read any Marx. He's like a self-identified socialist, and he's never read any Marx, whereas I've read lots of Marx. So, anyways, so in the TechCrunch, they ask one other question, which I think you have an answer for, that maybe they wouldn't expect, which is, to your point of technology solving some of our problems, they say, quote, or many of humanity's problems, or as part of them anyways, what does solve mean in the context of conflicts like the ongoing war in Israel and Gaza? Isn't the true solution an end to the conflict? So what role might technology play in ending the Israeli Palestine conflict?
Boy, that sounds great. That sounds like it's a great theoretical breakthrough, that you could solve conflicts by ending them.
I know, that's right.
Somebody should try that. I mean, look, I kind of say this in the piece, which is like, look, there are, in the manifesto, there are these deeper questions around the meaning of life, the ordering of society, the structure of civilization, these are fundamentally human questions. And so I think it's sort of a misapplication, or a category error, to kind of say, okay, technology is some magic panacea that ultimately solves all human problems. So I don't aspire to that. What I will say, and I do believe, is that on balance, it is going to be easier to solve the human problems, or at least make progress on them, in a wealthier society. Right. And so, and this is sort of like, let me come at it from a different direction, which is kind of the right-wing critique, which is basically, some of the right-wing populist critiques, are kind of nationalist, critiques, where they kind of say we should cut back on the amount of trade, for example. And, it always seems to me that, like, it's like, okay, we have the society we have today, we have the problems we have today, we are now going to deliberately do something to make society poorer. Right. And then it's going to be easier for us to solve our problem. And I think in general, that's not the case. Like, in general, it seems like, on balance, people being less well off, is quite likely to make whatever human problems we have more difficult. And then maybe I'll wrap on this point by just saying I use this term. I use this term that I borrowed from Brad DeLong. As he wrote a book with this title. It says "Slouching Towards Utopia," right? Which is like, I'm not a utopian. We are a fallen species. We are not going to, we are not going to achieve utopia. We're not going to solve all human problems overnight. The process of solving human problems is a very long process, obviously, that takes, enormous amount of thought and action by people over a long period of time. Like, there's no technological silver bullet to solving those problems. Having said that, if we can make things materially better in increments, and we can use technology as a fundamentally liberatory and enabling and empowering force, which I think it is, then I think we will improve our odds over time of being able to solve the societal problems. And by the way, again, I think the historical track record here is quite clear, right? Which is, in general, Steven Pinker has written at length about this. In general, there is some long run correlation between, material progress and a reduction in violent death. And I would certainly hope and expect that would continue.
Right. And I mean, one way I understood your kind of Walker Percy epigraph in context is that technology won't help us solve the problems of what it means to be a human being, but it won't. So if you're looking forward to do that, then you're going to be disappointed. But it will do a lot of other good things, and especially I think to the extent that it's hard to imagine situations in which problems are made better off by a shrinking pie, by being poor, less educated, less intelligent, access to fewer resources, etc.
Yeah, that's right. You could kind of use a left-wing term here a little bit. You could sort of view it as, basically technology and societal wealth, basically, creating space.
That's right.
To be able to spend more time and more effort on the deeper underlying questions.
Yeah, that's right. So you had another maybe more serious critic in Ezra Klein in the New York Times, who was sort of lamenting, I think he was a fan of It's Time to Build, your earlier essay. He's been a advocate of what he calls supply side progressivism, which is, actually build. If you want more housing, rather than doing a bunch of activism, you should build more housing, that kind of thing. But he didn't like this piece. He accused you of being a reactionary futurist. So let me read this quote. In their story, the accelerationist story, the old way that is being lost is the appetite for risk and inequality and dominance that drives technology forward and betters human life. What the muscled ancients knew and what today's flabby whingers have forgotten is that man must cultivate the strength and will to master nature and other men for the technological frontier to give way. But until now, you had to squint to see it, reading small press books or following your way down into the meme holes that have become the preferred form of communication among this crew. Then later on, that is in a way my core disagreement with Andreessen. Reactionary futurism is accelerationist in affect, but decelerationist in practice. Treating so much of society with such withering contempt will not speed up a better future. It will turn people against the politics and policies of growth, just as it did before. Trust is the most essential technology of all.
Where to begin?
Where to begin?
Let me start by saying I agree with a lot of it.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, he basically says that outright that his disagreement is an aesthetic one. So what is it about the aesthetics of this that turned some people off?
Yeah, look, I mean, look, he's an incredibly bright guy. He's a very bright guy. I mean, look, my interpretation, just, if I'm read him for a long time, is, he has a set of priors, right? And the set of priors are, sort of a fundamentally, leftist. I mean, he talks about this a lot. Sort of, at the end of the day, there's sort of a state, sort of power as a state exercise. The economy should be directed top down and sort of, wise and enlightened people, like Ezra Klein writing for newspapers like the New York Times, should basically be making these decisions on behalf of the less enlightened. And then, yes, we have this market economy, but, it's sort of riddled with, flaws and externalities, and we'll let it exist for a little bit, but we're going to fundamentally leash it, and we're going to make sure to steer it kind of as we go. I mean, look, that, that's a point of view. I mean, it's sort of, I guess I would just kind of say it's sort of the default point of view of the modern American elite. It's sort of it's what you might call the pro-social point of view. It's kind of the thing that all modern, kind of, private, kind of elite university graduates agree with. How's that going? How much faith do people have in that? How much do people, how well is that working? How much supply side progressivism is actually happening.
Well, this is the funny thing, of course, is that he's a prophet has no home in his own country, right? Like the people on the progressive left hates this idea of supply side progressivism. He's sort of the people who are most in favor of the reforms he's talking about are mostly on the right, it seems. But I do think there is something deeper to this disagreement.
Well, if I just pick on it a little bit, like look, like nuclear power. I mentioned this in the piece, but to me, like the ultimate kill shot on this is nuclear power, right? Which is like, look, Richard Nixon declared in 1971, the year I was born. He said that by 1980 he launched something called Project Independence, and he said by 1980 we should have 1,000 new nuclear power plants in the U.S. We should convert over the entire American power grid capability to nuclear. We should cut everything over, not use fossil fuels, cut everything over to electric. Electric cars are 100-year-old technology, and so kind of implicit in that was we'll cut over to electric cars in the 70s. This is during the oil, then the energy crisis in oil, and foreign entanglements and the PLO and all these crazy things happening in the Middle East at the time. Basically said, look, like we can become energy independent. We can, not be entangled in the Middle East. And then we can go zero emission. We can have our cake and eat it too. Like, we have the industrial civilization and technological wherewithal and societal wealth to be able to do it. And so let's hire a bunch of capitalists and let's have them build 1,000 nuclear power plants. And then, of course, he also, created the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which then prevented that from happening.
Hey,
right? And
nuclear is really regulated. You can't say they're not doing their job. I love that you went from the what was the AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission, goal, build atomic energy, which we did, and then as soon as you have the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, goal, regulate nukes. Man, we've done a good job at that.
Yeah, there was just another scare story. I don't remember the context, but there was just another scare story in Ezra's newspaper, one of these things, and it was kind of going through the litany of kind of moral problems in our time. And one of the things that one of the lines was something like, there are even some environmentalists now who are saying that nuclear power might be a safe and clean way to basically solve the climate problem. In sort of this tone of like shock and horror. Right. And so, his own newspaper, is opposed to what is obviously the silver bullet solution on carbon emissions. Obviously, the leading environmental activists, starting with our kind of modern day Joan of Arc, are staunchly opposed, to the obvious solution. The really smart the really high IQ environmentalists like Stuart Brand, figured this out years ago and are just like completely ignored.
Yeah,
and so again, you have this thing where it's like, even if you have figured out the answer, if you think a system of, sort of elite driven, top down, wise thought translated into effective policy action through a, empowered and, sort of vital government with the capability to kind of, what do they call it? State capacity. The ability to kind of, do these things, quote unquote, we should have another Apollo project or another Manhattan project. It's like, okay, it's been 52 years since Project Independence was declared. Like, how's it going?
There's still time. No, I mean, one does think that actually what many people perhaps like Ezra Klein assume are differences of policy or are at root differences of policy are in fact differences of aesthetics, which is to say differences of values at the deepest level. You mentioned earlier about this just being Clinton Gore liberalism, and of course there's something to that. I mean, the 90s had this kind of big tent Democratic Party, a coalition that was pro technology, pro growth, also but without surrounding some of the social commitments. But I think in some ways Ezra Klein's project is maybe more of the descendant of that. You might call it, but what it lacks is this appreciation for risk, for adventure, for daring. Even one might it's tempted to call it sort of last man liberalism, right? No shepherd in one herd. Everyone wants the same. Everyone is the same. He who feels differently goes voluntarily into the madhouse. What do you think? I mean, is how do you convince someone that doesn't have the vision?
Well, let me answer that, and then I also want to beat up on the right a little bit. So give me a chance to come back around on that. So Ezra, actually, it's interesting. Actually, he wrote his own refutation, I think, of his own argument in a different piece, and it was a piece that this other piece I like a lot, and I've sent it to a lot of people. And it has this incredible title. He says it's the problem with everything bagel liberalism.
Yes.
Which is just a spectacular title. Because everybody at one point has tried or at least everybody on the coast has tried an everything bagel. I have to say I never tried one living in rural Wisconsin, but I have had them on the West Coast. Everything. What he meant by it was basically it's a very detailed piece, and he did a lot of very detailed reporting for it, including talking to the Commerce Secretary, who's leading up a lot of the kind of state U.S. level industrial policy now. And it's basically reporting on basically what exactly is happening with the CHIPS Act, and what exactly is happening with this idea that we're going to use industrial policy to bring back, basically manufacturing of chips and ultimately many other, physical products, to the U.S. And look, I guess I'll just defer to the Ezra Klein of that piece, right? Which is, because basically his thesis of the piece basically is, this idea of sort of, centralized state, sort of enlightened thinking leading to state power, industrial policy. Maybe there is a world in which that is effective. Like, we don't live in that world anymore. Instead, we live in a world where the minute these things enter the political realm, which of course anything involved with industrial policy enters the political realm right out of the gate. Basically, those projects then get saddled with every other political issue, right? And so they get saddled with every other possible cause, right? Every other member of that alliance basically then tags in and basically says, well, I need this project to be consistent and supportive of everything that I believe in. And the next thing you know, you go from having a single goal, which is build a chip plant, to you have a dozen or 2 dozen or 3 dozen goals, many of which have, nothing to do with building an effective chip plant, and ultimately, in many cases just ruin the whole enterprise. Look, we just went through this not that long ago. There was a whole clean tech, green tech, industrial policy program in the 2000s. Silicon Valley got all wrapped up in it. There were lots of VCs super into it. There were lots of startups in energy and clean tech and clean water and all these things. And basically, the entire program was a total catastrophe, both for the companies and for the government. It didn't work. The once really successful kind of clean tech company that came out of that era was, of course, Tesla. Which of course is now the most hated, one of the most hated companies from these same people. You don't even have to go back that far to kind of find lessons as to why this approach, at least in our modern world, doesn't work very well. Let me beat up on the right a little bit, though, because there is a little bit of a horseshoe theory here also, which is I think that the sort of corresponding issues I see on the right, I bucket a couple different ways. So one is I do see a lot of people on the right over time who sort of entangle being pro-market with pro-business, and in particular with being pro-big business. And I do think there is this thing where, as businesses get big, there is this natural entanglement that starts to happen with the government, and, sort of things that start out looking like pro-free market policy end up basically being, quote unquote, pro-business policy, which basically turns into regulatory capture. And then, ultimately stagnation and all kinds of other problems, corruption. And so I think the right does fall into that. And then I also think, look, the sort of newly energized kind of populist right is also very enthusiastic about industrial policy, which I just talked about. And then, of course, also, very enthusiastic about trade restrictions as a way to, to kind of greater levels of material prosperity and happiness. And again, I mentioned earlier, I think that, basically that means, okay, step one, we have a problem. Step two, let's make ourselves poorer. Step three, somehow that leads to a solution. Makes it easier to get to a solution, I think, is also fundamentally flawed. So I would level a more or less approximately equal magnitude of critique on both sides.
Yeah, and here in Washington, that's absolutely a big part of the problem. I was responding to someone on Twitter/X the other day who was lamenting efforts to kind of bring antitrust action against Google and Amazon, a kind of professional libertarian, and pointing out that after Microsoft was forced to end self-preferencing in 2001, internet innovation didn't stop, but actually went up. Like, people built more software for PCs, investment in the whole sector increased, and then someone, long story short, similar kind of crowd came back and was lamenting the negative effect that antitrust might have on those really big innovative American companies, Google and Amazon. And I just thought to myself, these companies haven't been cutting edge innovators in 10, 15 years. Google might be more than Amazon. There is this weird disconnect in DC, especially on tech, with tech companies, that acts as if we don't know that companies, when they get really big, start putting all of their brain power into market strategies, which are very profitable, but don't actually build technology. And that as my friend Gary Tan has said, it's sort of little tech that's actually at the cutting edge.
Yeah, generally that's true. I always tell people, there's this narrative that Silicon Valley kind of goes around disrupting other industries, other spheres of life, kind of willy-nilly. And I always point out, the main industry that we, Silicon Valley startup world, venture capital, the main industry we're trying to disrupt is actually big tech. Google's a big juicy target, right? That's right in our backyard, and much easier to go after than Cigna or something out in the real world. So the disruption kind of activity and critique is actually mostly intramural still. But look, I guess I'd add one thing to what you said, which is, when you look at the dominance of a Google, Amazon's a little arguably a little bit different, although we could talk about that. But at Google, for sure, a lot of I would argue a lot of the market power that Google now has is that sort of, that you would classify as being a potential antitrust problem that potentially would need regulatory action. The irony is, a fair amount of that was created by regulatory protection.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. And so, and I just know this because I'm involved in these companies. Like, if you want to be an internet search company today, um, it's like the wall of regulations and restrictions and controls and compliance and audits and, like government engagement and reporting and dealing with like the level of overhead and state involvement in your business is extreme. And so when you look inside of Google, what you find is thousands and thousands and thousands of people whose job it is to basically deal with the government, manage the government. And in so doing, of course, they become entangled with the government. And of course, you see that, very clearly playing out today. They're, sitting here today, they are very entangled with the process of the creation of quote unquote AI regulations, which sort of mysteriously all kind of converge back to like making sure that only big companies like Google can build AI. Right.
Just to be safe.
But like,
just to be safe.
Yes. Just to be quote unquote safe. And so like you just like, there is a wall now that is so huge to be able to like, just to get in a position to be able to deal with the state the way that Google does, the numbers of thousands of people you would have to hire to do that basically make it like commercially not viable to even think about entering that industry. And then, look, the US is bad enough, like God help you if you want to function in Europe, like the EU and has just put up this like massive barrier. And so it's this backfire, this is a thing libertarian economists have been critiquing forever that nobody listens to, but like, quote unquote consumer protection regulations turn into regulatory capture as a virtual inevitability, and then basically they entrench a set of incumbents that then mysteriously don't care about customers and basically stop innovating. And that like many American industries have that characteristic today. We are somehow in a mood where we enthusiastically want more of that, and in many of the most important areas. And I think we know how that movie is going to play out. I think we see it playing out today. If people want stagnation, this is the formula for it.
So, speaking of disrupting other industries, one thing that you've done in the last few years is really kind of transformative. Is you've advocated for and built infrastructure for investment in what you call American dynamism. So could you kind of explain a little bit what that is, how you came to decide on this course of action, and how it affects your venture investment? How do you look at companies differently in this space? Because the economics of it, I think, must be very different from building a consumer or B2B SaaS company.
Yeah, so there's two parts to it, and I'll just get very, very practical on this one. There's sort of two key underlying ideas, and by the way, I'll credit my partners Catherine Boyle and David Ulovich in particular for a lot of this. Although what follows are my words, my attempt to explain, their thinking. So a couple things. So one is like, look, like all other critiques aside, it's just a fact that like 50 years ago, new technology basically was what you might call trickle down. And so it basically 50 years ago, 60, 70 years ago, new technology, and you saw this with the computer, new technology basically would start in the government, often built by the government or by contractors for the government, like the early computers were. And then at some point it would get put in a form where the biggest of companies could afford it and use it in the form of like mainframe computers. And then, basically years later, it would get packaged up into a format where smaller companies could buy it. And this was the mini computer. And then, sort of 30 years later, you'd ultimately basically distill it down to the point where you could offer it to consumers. And that took the form in computers of the PC. But it was this sort of very clear sequence, government, big company, small company, and then consumer. In the last 30 years, for most new areas of technology, especially in IT, that has reversed. And so the new technology basically goes to consumers first, then gets adopted by small companies that don't have a lot of processes and can do things quickly, and then gets adopted by big companies once they get through all their rules. And then later on, some point in the out years, the government figures out a way to use it. And so the government in the last 50 years, went from, the leading edge developer and an innovator of new technology to, most government people would tell you today, generally on the kind of on their back foot. But for structural reasons, not actually because of the activities of the people involved, but for structural reasons we could talk about. And so, the government's just like behind on a whole bunch of areas of technology where it would be like super valuable to be able to, to be able to do things. And so part is to basically, step in aggressively and say, okay, look, we're going to build a new set of technology companies for the government. So that's one. But then the other is like, look, government is not necessarily effective in every area of everything that it does. And there are certain areas in which it has noticeably degraded over time. Most recently, you might highlight law enforcement, as one of those areas. And so there is also sort of a clear increasing commercial need over time for people to be able to buy private sector alternatives to things that the government used to do in the past, but no longer can. I think that's from a societal standpoint, like that's every bit as important. Like if the government can do it, if Ezra's right, and the government can do all this stuff, great. But if not, there do need to be private sector alternatives. And it just so happens that there's some low hanging fruit in that world right now. And so we're sort of equally focused on building out what you might call alternatives to dysfunctional government.
How does that interact with the traditional venture model, or at least the venture model as it's played out in the kind of development of software?
Yeah, it's related. I mean, it's a lot of the same technologies, and it's hard. I don't want to draw like one of the things you don't want to do in venture. I don't think is draw too many sweeping conclusions because all the successes are kind of flukes, and so you want to kind of be very open to new configurations of thinking. But but I would say in general, the markets in American dynamism are more regulated than the typical computer markets, and so the barrier to entry to be able to do what you do is higher. And then that just makes it like a more complicated challenge. And so you need a founder and a team that is capable of not only building the product and bringing it to market, but also dealing with the other constituencies. And then the other is, I think as a consequence of that first one, number two, I think probably you would say that there are fewer bigger winners. Right? Like in unregulated markets, you can often get a very broad. You can get a large number of winners, and maybe it's actually a large number of small winners, just because people want specialization and choice. The more basically the minute you encounter something that's regulated, you do tend to see a market structure on the other side that's more centralized, just because it's harder to be in that business. And so if I had to guess, I would say, from a venture standpoint, I would say the returns in American dynamism are going to be more concentrated in a smaller set of companies. And then I would say, optimistically, those companies have the potential to get very large because the government kind of regulated markets actually tend to be very large markets, which is why they're so regulated. And so if you can crack the code on a new kind of defense, sort of primary defense technology company, or a new kind of company doing, law enforcement or education or healthcare or housing or energy, those markets are huge, right? And so, it maybe on the other side of that, you get a smaller number of companies, but they're much, much larger than what we think of today as tech companies.
Yeah. So, one of the things how does your thinking on American dynamism and on your overall venture practices and investor relate to the advantages of the need as human beings to build in the real world and not just in the world of bits, so to speak? Because there seems to be a bit of a tension in your writing between your essay on It's Time to Build and this one, and you had an essay about the notion of reality privilege, of the notion that for somebody, yes, living in your Apple Vision Pro, soon to be commercialized, and I'm sure the cost of that will come down very quickly. Might sound kind of dystopian if you have a beautiful apartment in the Mission District or something, but if you live in an RV in northern Wisconsin, then suddenly it's much more interesting and entertaining and fulfilling maybe than the reality that you have to deal with. So how do you think about those two tensions between the desire and drive to build in the real world versus the sort of escape route into virtuality?
Yeah, so I'll start with the material part of it, and then we can talk about the cultural part. So the material part. So look, Peter Thiel and Tyler Cohen, before me, have talked at length about kind of this dispersion of bifurcation in the economy between kind of the atom, the world of atoms, where you basically can't do new things, or it's extremely difficult to get permission to do them, and then the world of bits, in which you can do whatever you want. And then of course the critique is, well, the world of bits is fine and great, but like ultimately somebody does have to build a house or a dam or a road or something, or a nuclear power plant. And if you can't do those things, then you really have cut off a huge amount of the things that matter to material welfare. So I won't, as Peter in particular has written at length about that, so I won't repeat that. I guess I'd add a couple of things to that. I think you'd say philosophically what actually happened there was actually Richard Feynman was right when he said, this is like 50, 60 years ago, he said he sort of charted a new path for sort of scientific investigation, and his line I think was that there's lots of room at the bottom. And basically what he said, at least what I remember what he said was, basically is like, look, for a very long time we've thought about science, technology, industry is building huge things, right? Huge spaceships, huge nuclear power plants, huge this, huge that, huge dam, Hoover Dam. It's like, look, there, atomic technology is about something happening at the very at the micro level, at the smallest level, and there's tremendous amounts to learn about that, about physics, about quantum, in that world and so forth. And then look, we collectively as a civilization created this incredible kind of new form of what I call alchemy, modern alchemy, which is the world of bits, which is to its both to its detriment and to its, I think, benefit is completely intangible. We created this world now where we manufacture chips with we have transistors now at the 2 nanometer level, right, which is this just like extraordinary technological accomplishment. Right. And so like there is this entire world at the bottom. Right. And I think there's actually like a crude kind of explanation, I think, to a certain extent for kind of what's happened, which is the stuff that people kind of focus on and regulate and get mad about and become political topics are the things that you can see. They're the big things. Like, why can't we build housing? Why can't we build new office towers? Why can't we build nuclear power plants as well? Because you could actually see those getting built and you can hate them as a physical artifact. Right. Whereas like, these computer nerds are just like doing all this random software stuff. And yeah, we might freak out every once in a while at Napster or AI or something, but like fundamentally it's like a bunch of code and whatever. Like how much can it matter? It's not real. Right. And so I give the world of bits a little bit more credit. But the other thing I would say is, I translate this in economic terms, which is Mark Perry has this great chart, because he calls it the chart of the century. And it basically disambiguates prices over time by sector in the economy. And basically what it shows is that, you have a certain kind of price level, rate of inflation, the economy as a whole. You kind of draw that as a straight line across the chart over time, sort of a chart of prices. And then you basically say you have sectors that are more centered on bits and not atoms, right? Immaterial versus material, maybe more knowledge centric as opposed to raw material centric. And then certainly, sort of more technology centric, and then certainly less government regulated. And these are sectors, these are sectors for sure: software, media, right, journalism. By the way, retail, e-commerce, all forms of entertainment, consumer electronics, television sets, anything that plugs into the wall. And is electronic. And then also it actually turns out a lot of like actually mass market consumer goods like food and clothing you also put in this sector. And generally prices in those sectors are falling over. They're flat or falling over time. So those are sort of high productivity growth, less regulated and deflationary sectors of the economy. And by the way, a lot of technological progress happening in those sectors. Like every single thing I just mentioned, like technology has been racing ahead. You have these other sectors that he puts in red where the prices are basically up and to the right. And of course, that's, what is that? It's housing, it's education, it's healthcare. And then it's basically everything associated with the government. So it's, the government itself, and then, basically all of the ancillary, fields like law that are kind of attached to administration that are attached to the government. And their prices are absolutely skyrocketing, right? And so you could kind of say like, okay, if current trends continue, and the bifurcation is like just like totally obvious and sustained over time, and you could kind of chart out, and you could say over time, like we're heading into a world where you're going to be able to buy a 100-inch flat screen TV that's 8K, 16K, that is just like the most spectacular like movie experience you ever had in your living room for $100. But it's going to cost you $1 million to send your kid to a 4-year college, right? And it's like, okay. That seems wrong, right? And then you think about, if you do a pie chart of GDP, right? What you find is the sectors that are deflationary, right? High technology, high productivity, falling prices, like those are small slices of GDP. If the sectors that are red, where the prices are rising and productivity is falling, right? Those sectors are large chunks of GDP. And then there's a mathematical effect, which of course, if you project that out, just mechanically, what's going to happen is the red sectors, the high price growing sectors, mathematically are going to just dominate the entire economy, right? They're going to be the entire thing. And so that's the world that we're in. That's the world that we're heading towards. I believe that's bad for a number of reasons. One of the big reasons I think that's bad is actually politically, in the sense of like social cohesion, both on the left and the right, which is take the first three sectors I mentioned that are super high, that have super fast growth prices, healthcare, education, housing, like that's the American dream. Right. And so what we're doing is we have set up an economy in which we are allowing the price of the American dream to skyrocket to infinity. And then and this is a right wing critique I agree with, we are then going to use, Netflix and Cheetos and meth as sort of palliative care, for people who can't have a family, can't have a home, right, can't have a good education, right, can't, live in a good neighborhood. And like, this is the track we're on. Like, however we got here, you can analyze that to death. Like, that is the track that we're on. I think at some point, we have to really go after those sectors, right? That are kind of eating everything. And we have to break the back of the cycle of sort of increasing regulation and decreasing productivity and escalating prices. Or I think our politics are going to go like completely bananas. Because economically, people are going to find themselves completely defranchised.
What's funny is all of your critics, when they're not wringing their hands about this, in the words of, this is from Vice, this is a great headline, major tech investor calls architect of fascism a saint in unhinged manifesto, which we'll get to. When they're not wringing your hands about your unhinged manifesto, what are they complaining about? They're complaining about student loans, the price of housing, the cost of healthcare, low wages. And these are all the sectors that technology hasn't been able to address, where there's been technological stagnation, productivity stagnation. Nobody's complaining that their TV is getting too cheap too quickly. Yeah.
Imagine waking up one morning and learning that it was actually going to cost, imagine that you were going to learn that actually the price of a 4-year college degree for your kid was going to fall in half in the next 5 years. Right. As opposed to double. Like, just imagine the impact that would have on people's psychology.
Wow. Yeah.
But by the way, including their decision to have kids, like you'd just be like, oh, wow. Like, wow. Like, that's fantastic. I can't believe I live in a world in which, like, basically there's so much progress. And like, I see no reason why that can't happen. And I see an entire system that's basically spring-loaded. Let me add one more thing on this. And this is an Arnold Klein observation, which is one of the problems you get into when you get a sector like healthcare, education, housing, where you get this kind of process where you have price escalation, you have basically productivity probably falling in those sectors. And then you have basically, a high level of government involvement. Basically what happens is, people get mad. And so voters are mad that housing and education, healthcare are so expensive. And so what happens is the government basically steps in and subsidizes. Right. And you have that in all three of those sectors, right? You've got federal mortgage subsidies in the trillions of dollars. You've got federal student loan subsidies in the trillions of dollars. And of course, you have federal, healthcare, education, housing all have massive government subsidies. What happens when you inject a large amount of subsidy into a market in which the supply is fixed by the government, right? Which is prices rise further. Right. And so we're in this doom loop. A big part of what's happened, why prices are rising so fast there, is we're in this doom loop where the more those prices rise, the more government subsidies get applied. The more government subsidies get applied, the more prices rise, right? And so forth and so on. And so it's a doom loop. It's an upward spiral. It just gets worse and worse. The politics around those sectors just get more and more toxic. Every politician in the moment just says, look, let's just do some more subsidies so people will vote for me this time. But you're fueling an upward trajectory that has no end and will ultimately, conclude at the point where normal people just simply can't afford these things at all. And at some point, like we do have to address that. Maybe there would be a way to address that politically, although the incentives seem very misaligned there. And so I would obviously propose that we solve those problems technologically.
Yes. So there you have it, folks. Choice between the Chesapeake doom loop or the make San Francisco Star Trek again approach. So we could talk for hours, Marc, but I think we're out of time. It's been really wonderful having you on. Thank you so much for joining us in the Dynamist.
Good. Awesome. Thank you, John.